Let him rot. We're not paying for another night in ICU, my mother told the doctor while I was on a ventilator. She signed the discharge papers to save money for my brother's new house. I said nothing. When I woke up, I made one call. What I did left her begging within 24 hours. The ventilator tube came out on a Monday. I did not feel it leave. A nurse tilted my chin. A doctor said something about spontaneous breathing, and then the plastic was gone, and my throat was raw and open, and I was pulling air into my lungs with the kind of effort most people never have to think about. The ceiling above me was acoustic tile with a water stain in the shape of a boot. I counted the tiles while I remembered how to swallow. My name is Griffin Chandler. I am 36 years old. I am a healthcare risk management coordinator at St. Joseph's Regional Medical Center. 5 days earlier, on January 8th, a box truck ran a red light at the intersection of Crane and 4th and hit me while I was cycling to work. The impact fractured 3 ribs, collapsed my left lung, and put me in the ICU at Mercy General on a ventilator. Mercy General is a sister hospital in the same system where I work. The nurses on the 4th floor know my name. Some of them know what I do for a living, which is review the exact kind of incident that almost killed me. I was unconscious for 4.5 days. During those 4.5 days, something happened that I did not learn about until a charge nurse named Nadine Farrell sat down next to my bed on the afternoon of January 13th and told me what my mother had done. Nadine pulled the curtain closed. She sat in the blue vinyl chair and folded her hands and looked at me the way nurses look at patients when the information they are about to deliver is not medical. She told me that on my second night in the unit, my mother had arrived with my brother. She told me that Josephine had presented herself to Dr. Sato, my attending physician, as my healthcare proxy. She told me that Josephine had reviewed the ICU billing estimate, that the number was $8,500 per night. Nadine opened a small notebook from her scrub pocket. She had written it down that night because she knew what she was hearing was wrong, and she wanted the record to exist outside of memory. She read what Josephine had said to Dr. Sato, the exact words. Nadine had captured them in the notebook the same night, sitting at the nurse's station after the discharge was processed, while the syllables were still fresh. Let him rot. We are not paying for another night in this unit. $8,500 a night so he can lie there breathing through a machine while his brother's house sits half-framed in the cold. Griffin has been writing checks his whole life. That is all he is good for. He is not a father. He is not a husband. He is a 36-year-old man who goes home to an empty apartment and reviews lawsuits for a living. Nadine turned the page. There was more. After Dr. Sato stepped away to process the paperwork, Josephine and Dario stood in the hallway outside the ICU doors. Nadine was behind the station partition, close enough to hear. Josephine had said to Dario, quietly, as if the volume made it less real, "If he wakes up, he will write another check. If he does not, you get the life insurance. Either way, the house gets finished." Nadine paused. The heart monitor beeped 4 times. She told me the rest in the same steady voice. Josephine had signed an against medical advice discharge form. She had authorized the removal of ventilator support and transfer to a general ward. Dr. Sato had tried to explain the risks. Josephine had interrupted him and said that if he would not process the paperwork, she would find someone who would. Nadine had objected formally and filed a clinical hold request, which delayed the transfer by 48 hours, pending a secondary attending review. During those 48 hours, my lungs began recovering on their own. By day 4, I was breathing independently. The ventilator was removed because I was ready, not because of the AMA order, but the discharge authorization was still in the system. If my lungs had not recovered, they would have pulled the ventilator anyway and transferred me to a general ward per Josephine's order. I stared at the ceiling tiles. The boot-shaped water stain was directly above me. My hands were flat on the mattress and I could feel the texture of the hospital sheet, the thin cotton weave, the warmth of my own skin underneath it. My mother had stood in this room and told a doctor to let me die so that her other son could finish building a house. If you are new here, welcome to Family Secret Tales. This is the story of how my mother signed my discharge papers while I was on a ventilator, and what happened when I made one phone call that changed everything within 24 hours. I need to tell you how we got here, because the ICU is not where this story starts. It starts 12 years ago, when I got my first real paycheck and made the mistake of depositing it into a family that saw generosity as a utility bill. My mother, Josephine Chandler, raised two sons, me and Dario. Our father left when I was 8 and Dario was 5. He sent child support checks for 3 years. Then the checks stopped, and then the return address stopped, and then he was a name on a birth certificate and nothing else. Josephine worked as a dental receptionist for 27 years at a practice on Millbrook Road. She made $34,000 at her peak. She retired at 59 because her back could not handle the standing and because I told her I would cover her mortgage and insurance so she could rest. Dario is 3 years younger than me. He is the kind of man who enters every room expecting the room to adjust to his temperature. He sells cars at Fennec Motors and makes $48,000 a year and spends $62,000. The difference between what Dario earns and what Dario spends has always come from somewhere, and for 12 years, that somewhere has been me. The arrangement was never negotiated. It was assumed. When I got my first job out of college as a patient safety associate at a hospital in the next county, Josephine did not say congratulations. She said, "Now you can help with the mortgage." I was 24. I had student loans. I had a car payment. And I started sending $1,400 a month to my mother's bank account because she asked and because I believed that being needed was the same thing as being valued. It took me 12 years to learn the difference. I started paying Josephine's mortgage at 24, $400 a month. I started paying her supplemental health insurance when she retired, $680 a month. I paid her property taxes twice when she fell behind, $3,200 each time. When Dario decided to build a house on a lot he found on the south side of town, a lot he could not afford on a car salesman's commission, I co-signed the construction loan for $285,000 because the bank would not approve Dario's income alone. I gave him $52,000 for the down payment. That was 4 years of my savings. I wrote a promissory note before I wrote the check. 1 page, 2 signatures, a repayment date, and a 6% interest rate. Dario signed it at my kitchen table and said, "I will pay you back when the house appreciates." The note said 12 months. It has been 10. He has not mentioned it since. The subject exists in the same place as our father's forwarding address. Total monthly outflow to my family, $2,800. Total since I started, over $340,000. I kept a spreadsheet, not because I expected repayment, because I am the kind of person who tracks where things go. That is my personality and it is also my profession. In risk management, you measure exposure. My family was my largest exposure, and I measured it every month and paid it every month and said nothing every month. Josephine never said thank you. Not once in 12 years. She said, "That is what family does." She said, "Your brother needs help right now." She said, "You do not have children, Griffin. You can afford it." The math of my life, according to Josephine, was simple. I had no wife, no kids, no mortgage of my own. Therefore, my money was not mine. It belonged to the family member who needed it most, and that member was always Dario. She once told my ex-girlfriend Lena, during a dinner I had organized at my apartment to introduce them, "Griffin is not marriage material. He works too much, and he cares about the wrong things. But he is reliable. You can count on his check." She said it while pouring wine. She said it the way people say things they have thought so many times the words have lost their edges. Lena broke up with me 3 weeks later. She said she could not build a life with a man whose family saw him as an ATM with a heartbeat. She was right. I did not argue. I also did not stop the payments. Rory Kelman is the person I chose when the hospital asked me to designate a healthcare proxy. Rory has been my closest friend since our freshman year of college. When we were assigned to the same dorm room, and discovered that we both organized our desk drawers by function, and neither of us could sleep with noise. We were roommates for 4 years. He is a paramedic now, 37, married with 2 kids, living 20 minutes outside the city, in a house with a blue door that his wife painted the week they moved in. Rory is the kind of man who answers his phone at 3 in the morning and says, "What do you need?" before he asks what happened. 3 years ago, when St. Joseph's required me to file a healthcare proxy as part of my onboarding, I named Rory because I knew 2 things about him with absolute certainty. He would not let me suffer, and he would not let anyone make decisions about my body based on how much I cost per night. One specific moment tells you everything about the difference between Rory and my family. 2 years ago, I had pneumonia bad enough to spend a night in the ER at Mercy General. I was dehydrated, feverish, coughing so hard I cracked a rib. Josephine called twice that night. The first time she asked whether my insurance would cover the ER visit. The second time she asked whether I had set up the automatic wire transfer for the following month, because she had a property tax payment coming due. She did not ask about the rib. She did not ask about the fever. She asked about the check. Rory drove 40 minutes through a snowstorm. He sat in the ER waiting room for 6 hours reading a paperback he brought from home. When I was discharged at 2 a.m., he drove me to my apartment, walked me inside, checked my refrigerator, drove to a 24-hour grocery store, bought soup and crackers and Gatorade, brought them back, put them in my kitchen, and left a note on the counter that said, "Eat, sleep. Call me if you need anything. Do not call your mother because she will ask about the deductible." He did not ask about insurance. He asked if I could breathe. That is why he is my proxy. That is why what Josephine did is not a misunderstanding. It is a forgery committed against the one legal document that says who I trust with my life. I almost closed my eyes and let it go. The ribs were on fire, and the morphine was wearing off, and every breath felt like swallowing a staple. But Nadine was sitting next to me with both hands still folded, and the words my mother said were not going to leave that room without me. He is not a father. He is not a husband. He is a 36-year-old man who goes home to an empty apartment. Those words were still in the air. I could feel them the way you feel a draft in a room where someone left a window open. I reached for my phone on the bedside table. Nadine handed it to me. I made one call. Not to Josephine, not to Dario, not to Rory, not to a lawyer. I called Hugo Strickland. Hugo is the Chief Compliance Officer at Mercy General. I have worked with him for 6 years across the hospital system. We sit in the same quarterly review meetings. We review the same incident categories. He knows my name, my title, my case history, and my professional judgment. He also knows that when a risk management coordinator from a sister hospital calls from a patient bed, the conversation is not casual. "Hugo, this is Griffin Chandler. I am currently admitted to your facility, ICU, 4th floor. 2 days ago, an individual presented a healthcare proxy form and gained decision-making authority over my care. That individual is not my designated proxy. My proxy is Rory Kelman. I filed the original form 3 years ago. I need you to pull the current proxy on file, pull my original, and tell me how a substitution was accepted without my knowledge or consent. I also need the AMA discharge order reviewed and the incident documented before end of business today." Hugo was quiet for 4 seconds. I know because I counted. "Griffin, stay where you are. I am coming to the floor." Hugo arrived in 11 minutes. He brought the hospital's patient rights coordinator, a woman named Irene, who carried a tablet and a manila folder, and the floor supervisor. Hugo closed the curtain around my bed. He pulled both proxy forms from the system and printed them at the nurse's station. He brought them to me side by side on a clipboard. The original, filed January 2024, carried my signature and named Rory Kelman as my designated healthcare agent. The second form, filed July 2025, during an annual physical intake appointment, carried a signature that said Griffin Chandler, but was not written by Griffin Chandler. I knew because I know my own handwriting the way I know my own breathing. The G was looped wrong. The RIF connection was broken where mine is continuous. The spacing between the first name and last name was too wide by a full centimeter. The pen pressure was lighter than mine, tentative, the way a hand writes when it is copying rather than signing. It was my mother's handwriting pretending to be mine. She had practiced it, but she had not practiced it enough. Hugo set both forms on my bed tray. He compared them for a long time, moving his eyes between the two signatures. Then he looked at me. "The discharge is reversed. You are readmitted effective now under your original care plan. I am filing a formal incident report and initiating a full compliance investigation into how the proxy substitution was accepted without proper identity verification. Nadine Farrell's objection is documented and will be included. Dr. Sato will be notified." "Thank you." "Do not thank me. This should not have happened in my facility." I almost thanked him and stopped there. But the spreadsheet on my laptop at home had 12 years of numbers on it, and the house that was sitting half-framed on the south side of town was built with those numbers. And the woman who told a doctor to let me rot was still sleeping in a house my wire transfers had been paying for since she retired. So that same afternoon, with the proxy forms still on my tray table and the oxygen monitor beeping behind me, I called Pierce Galloway, my attorney. Pierce and I have worked together for 4 years. He handles my personal legal matters the way I handle risk reports, with documentation, without emotion, and with an understanding that the facts do not need decoration to be effective. I called him from the hospital bed with the proxy forms still on my tray table and the oxygen monitor beeping behind me. Pierce, I need 3 things executed before tomorrow morning. First, cancel the monthly wire transfer of $2,800 to Josephine Chandler, effective immediately. The January 1st payment was the last. Second, send a formal co-signer withdrawal notice to the construction lender for Dario Chandler's loan, reference number CL47-2025, $285,000, Lot 47, Southridge Estates. Third, draft a demand letter for the $52,000 I provided as the down payment for that construction project, payable within 30 days. Serve all 3 documents by morning. Pierce asked one question. Griffin, are you certain you want to move on all 3 simultaneously? That is a complete financial separation. My mother forged my healthcare proxy to gain the legal authority to discharge me from ICU while I was on a ventilator. She told my doctor to let me rot. She calculated that my life was worth less than $8,500 a night, which is less than half of what I send her family every month, I am certain. Pierce said, I will have everything served by 7 a.m. If you have been following this and you feel the weight of what is coming, subscribe to Family Secret Tales. Because my mother arrived at the hospital the next morning, and what she walked into was not the same room she walked out of. Josephine came through the ICU doors at 8:40 a.m. on January 14th, 14 hours after the wire cancellation, 10 hours after Pierce served the co-signer withdrawal notice. She had driven to the hospital in her gray winter coat, the one with the loose button on the left cuff that I had offered to fix twice, and she had declined both times because accepting small help from me would have meant acknowledging the larger help she took for granted. She was carrying her purse against her stomach with both hands pressed tight, the way she holds it when she is walking into a room where she already knows the answer is no. Her eyes were swollen. Her lipstick was on, which meant she had stood in front of a mirror and chosen this face, which meant this was not impulse. It was strategy. She had rehearsed. She stopped at the foot of my bed. The curtain was open. Nadine was at the nurse's station 12 feet away, charting. A respiratory therapist named Luis was checking the oxygen calibration on the wall monitor behind me. 2 witnesses. My mother looked at both of them and chose to proceed anyway. Dario called me at 6 this morning. He said the bank sent a letter about the co-signer. He said the wire did not come through. Griffin, what have you done? What have I done? I pressed the bed control and raised myself to sitting. The ribs screamed along the fracture lines, 3 of them in sequence, like notes on a scale that only plays pain. I let them. You told my doctor to let me rot, Mom. You signed papers to pull my ventilator while I was breathing through a tube. You wanted me off this unit so you could save $8,500 a night for Dario's house. You told Dr. Sato that if I woke up, I would write another check. And if I did not wake up, Dario would get the life insurance. Either way, the house gets finished. Those are your exact words. Nadine was standing right there when you said every one of them. Josephine's eyes went to Nadine. Nadine met them and held them. Josephine looked back at me. She tried to explain. She said she was scared, that she was not thinking clearly, that the bills were adding up and Dario's contractor had told her the crew would walk off if the next draw did not come through by February. She used the word panicked twice. She used it the way people use it when they want the listener to believe the decision was accidental. You did not panic. You planned. The healthcare proxy form naming you as my agent was filed 6 months before my accident, July 2025, during my annual physical. You submitted it during intake while I was in the exam room. You forged my signature. You replaced Rory Kellman, the person I chose, with yourself, the person I did not choose. That is not panic. That is premeditation. Josephine's mouth opened. Her right hand gripped the strap of her purse, and her left hand went to the bed rail. Her knuckles went white against the brushed aluminum. You have been getting $2,800 a month from me for 12 years. That is $340,000. I have paid your mortgage for 144 consecutive months. I have paid your health insurance since the day you retired. I paid your property taxes twice when you fell behind. I gave Dario $52,000 for a house I was never going to live in, and I co-signed a loan for $285,000 that he could not qualify for with his own name, because his own name is not worth what I have been paying for it. I paused. The room was quiet except for the monitor behind me. And when I was lying in this bed with a tube in my throat and 3 broken ribs and a collapsed lung, you stood in front of a doctor and a nurse, and you said I was not a father, not a husband, that I go home to an empty apartment and review lawsuits for a living. You said the only thing I am good for is writing checks. You said if I died, Dario would get the life insurance and the house would get finished. And then you signed papers to pull my ventilator. You forged a legal document to get the authority, and then you used that authority to try to let me die. Josephine's chin dropped. Her breathing was fast and shallow. She tried to speak twice. The third time words came out. Josephine tried 3 more angles in rapid succession. She said she would put the money back. She said she and Dario could work out a repayment plan. She said I did not need to involve attorneys. Each offer was smaller than the one before. A woman negotiating with a building that had already caught fire. You involved attorneys when you forged a legal document. I am just responding. She tried an apology next. She said the word sorry. She said she had been frightened. She said the bills were enormous. She blamed the contractor for pressuring Dario. She blamed the hospital for the charges. She blamed everyone in the room except the person who had picked up a pen and written my name in her handwriting on a form that controlled whether I lived or died. You could have done nothing. You could have let me stay on the ventilator and let the machine do its job. That was the only thing anyone needed to do. Instead, you walked into this room, looked at a doctor, and said, "Let him rot." You calculated my value per night and decided I was not worth it. That was not fear. That was accounting. I pulled both proxy forms from the folder on my tray table and held them up side by side. This is my handwriting. I pointed to the original, Rory's name clearly legible in the agent field. This is your handwriting pretending to be mine. I pointed to the forged form. The compliance office has confirmed the discrepancy. The incident report is filed. If you want to argue that this signature is mine, you can make that argument to the hospital's legal team, who are currently reviewing the liability your forgery created for this institution. Josephine's legs gave slightly. She leaned on the bed rail with both hands now. Her coat hung open. Her face had lost its structure, the way a face loses structure when the muscles that hold an expression stop receiving instructions. Griffin, please, I am your mother. I made a mistake. We can fix this. Tell them to stop the investigation. Tell the bank to keep the co-signature. Dario's house is half built. The framing is done. The plumber is scheduled for next week. If the loan defaults, he loses everything. He loses my everything, my co-signature, my $52,000, my monthly payments. The house is not his. It is mine, built on money I earned while he sold cars, and you told my girlfriends I was not marriage material. You told the doctor to let me rot. You forged my proxy. You signed my discharge to fund a house I paid for. The check writer is done. Josephine made a sound, not a word. A sound from the back of her throat that was older than language. She sat down in the blue vinyl chair where Nadine had sat the day before. She put both hands over her face. Her shoulders shook. Nadine looked at me across the station. Louise stepped out of the room quietly. Mom. My voice was level, not soft, not loud. Level, the way a report reads when the findings are final. This is the last payment, the last co-signature, the last wire transfer. I am filing a fraud complaint with the hospital's legal department for the forged proxy form. I am referring the discharge to the state health department for review. Pierce is handling the financial separation. Your mortgage payment is your responsibility now. Dario's house is Dario's problem. Do not come to this room again. Do not call me. If you need to communicate, do it through my attorney. She sat in that chair for 12 minutes after I stopped talking. I know because the clock on the wall was behind her, and I watched it. She did not move. She did not speak. She held her purse in her lap and stared at the floor tiles until a nurse asked her to leave. because visiting hours for ICU were ending. 2 days later, on January 20th, Pierce Galloway visited Josephine's home. Dario and Ember were there. Pierce had called ahead and told Josephine to have all parties present because the matters he needed to discuss affected all three of them. Pierce is the kind of attorney who does not raise his voice because his documents do the speaking for him. He sat at Josephine's kitchen table and opened a folder. Dario sat across from him with his arms crossed. Ember stood by the refrigerator. Josephine sat at the end of the table, closest to the door. Pierce laid 3 documents on the table and explained each one in turn. The monthly wire transfer of $2,800 to Josephine had been permanently canceled. The last payment was January 1st. There would be no further payments. He slid the first document toward Josephine. She did not pick it up. The second document was the cosigner withdrawal. Griffin had formally withdrawn his guarantee on the construction loan for Lot 47, South Ridge Estates. Without the cosigner, the loan would be reviewed against Dario's income and credit profile. Pierce looked at Dario. Your individual income does not meet the lender's qualification threshold. The bank will initiate a default review. Dario's face went through 3 stages in 4 seconds. Confusion, then calculation, then the look of a man who has just realized the floor he has been standing on was never his. He said, I could not do that. He said I had signed the loan. He said I had agreed. Pierce explained that the construction loan's guarantor agreement included a provision allowing withdrawal during the construction phase if the guarantor's financial circumstances changed materially or if the guarantor was pursuing legal action against members of the borrower's household. Griffin was now pursuing a fraud complaint against the borrower's mother, who was also the loan's cosigner. The conflict made continued guarantee untenable. The bank would review the loan against the primary borrower's standalone qualifications. Ember's arms dropped from her chest. She asked about the $52,000. She called it a gift. Pierce said it was a loan. He said Griffin had documented it as such and communicated it as such at the time of transfer. A demand letter had been sent. Repayment within 30 days. Dario stood up. His chair scraped against the linoleum. He called it revenge. He called it a tantrum. Pierce closed the folder. Your mother told a physician to discontinue life-sustaining treatment for a patient on a ventilator based on a forged legal document. She referenced your life insurance payout as an acceptable alternative to your brother's survival. That is not a hard call. That is a crime. And the hospital has referred the forgery to the county prosecutor. Dario's mouth opened. No words came out. He looked at Josephine. Josephine was looking at the table. Pierce stood. If there are questions, direct them to my office. Mr. Chandler has requested no further direct communication from any of you. He left. The door closed behind him. Ember sat down. Dario was still standing. Josephine had not moved. 8 days later, on January 22nd, Ember Chandler and a man named Pastor Alden arrived at my apartment. I had been discharged legitimately on the 18th, signed by Dr. Sato with my own hand, and I was sitting on my couch with 3 pillows behind my ribs and a cup of tea on the side table. Ember stood in my doorway. Pastor Alden stood behind her with his hands clasped low, the way ministers hold their hands when they believe the posture itself is a form of argument. Ember had been crying before she reached the door. Her mascara was smudged under her left eye, and her voice was thick with the kind of distress that comes preloaded. She told me Josephine was falling apart. She said Dario could not sleep. She said the bank had sent a default notice, and the crew had left the construction site. She said Pastor Alden was there because he believed forgiveness was healing, and that families could come back from even the hardest things. She said these words in the order she had rehearsed them, and each one landed on my doorstep like a piece of mail addressed to someone who no longer lived at that address. Pastor Alden stepped forward. Griffin, your mother has been carrying a tremendous weight these past weeks. She knows what she did was wrong. I am not here to excuse it. I am here because I believe grace can build a bridge that anger cannot. I almost invited them in, but the original proxy form was on my kitchen counter, Rory's name in my handwriting, and the weight of it held me in my doorway. Grace is not a thing you give to someone who forged your name on a document that controlled whether you lived or died. I reached behind me and picked up the forged proxy form from the counter. I had kept it in a clear plastic sleeve. I held it up so both of them could see it. This is my mother's handwriting pretending to be mine. She forged this form 6 months before my accident to give herself the legal authority to make medical decisions for me. Then she used that authority to sign my discharge from ICU while I was on a ventilator. She told my doctor to let me rot. She told him that if I died, Dario would get the life insurance and the house would get finished either way. I looked at Pastor Alden. Tell me which scripture covers forging a legal document to let your son die so your other son can build a house. Pastor Alden's clasped hands separated. He looked at the form. He looked at Ember. He took a step back. Ember wiped her eyes. She said Dario did not know about the proxy. She said he had not known Josephine forged it. Her voice was asking me to separate the brother from the mother. Dario was standing in the ICU hallway when she said, "Let him rot." He heard every word. He did not stop her. He did not call Rory. He did not call anyone. He went home and waited for the house to get finished. That is not innocence. That is agreement. I closed the door. Not hard, not soft. I closed it the way you close a file when the review is complete and every finding has been documented and there is nothing left to add that would change the conclusion. The proxy form in its plastic sleeve was warm from my hand. I set it back on the counter and made tea and sat on my couch and watched the afternoon light move across the floor until it was gone. If this story hit close to something real, share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe to Family Secret Tales. The construction lender placed Dario's loan under default review on January 28th, 20 days after my accident. Without my co-signature guaranteeing the debt, the loan's risk profile exceeded the bank's threshold for a borrower in Dario's income bracket. The next scheduled construction draw, $1,800 for plumbing, rough-in, and electrical, was frozen. Dario's framing crew, who had been waiting on materials money for 2 weeks, while the January cold warped the exposed lumber, walked off the site on February 2nd. The foreman left a voicemail that Dario played for Ember 3 times, each time louder, as if volume would change the words. "Call us when the check clears." The check was never going to clear because the person who had been clearing every check for 12 years was lying in a hospital bed that his mother tried to empty. Dario tried to refinance independently. He sat in the loan officer's office at the same bank where I had co-signed, wearing the polo shirt he wears to the dealership, holding a folder of pay stubs. The bank ran his numbers. A car salesman making $48,000 a year with $22,000 in revolving credit card debt and 0 assets other than the half-built structure on Lot 47 does not qualify for a $285,000 construction loan without a co-signer. The loan officer told him the application was denied before he finished the income verification section. Dario drove home and did not speak to Ember for the rest of the evening. The hospital's compliance investigation concluded on February 10th. Hugo's final report was 16 pages long. It confirmed that the proxy substitution was accepted without proper identity verification, that the charged nurse's documented objection was overruled by the attending physician without adequate justification, and that the against medical advice discharge was processed based on a forged authorization document. The report noted that the patient's designated proxy, Rory Kelman, was never contacted, never consulted, and never informed of the discharge decision. Mercy General's legal department sent Josephine a formal notice stating that the forged proxy form had been referred to the county prosecutor's office for potential charges of medical document fraud and unauthorized interference with patient care. Dr. Sato received a professional review letter and a mandatory retraining requirement on proxy verification protocols. Nadine Farrell received a written commendation for her clinical judgment and her documented objection, which the report described as the single point of appropriate resistance in an otherwise cascading systems failure. Josephine's supplemental health insurance lapsed on February 15th. The premium had been covered by my monthly wire transfer for 3 years running. Without the payment, the insurer sent a grace period notice, then a termination notice, then a final letter confirming that coverage ended on the 15th. Josephine received a bill for the outstanding $680 premium and a notice that reactivation would require a new application and full medical underwriting. She was 61 with a history of hypertension, 2 knee replacements, and a prescription list that ran to 11 medications. The premium on a new individual plan at her age and health profile, if she could even qualify, would exceed $1,100 a month. She had been paying zero. The distance between zero and $1,100 is the distance between having a son who writes checks and having a son who stopped. Josephine stopped attending her Wednesday church group in February, not because anyone asked her to leave, not because a committee voted, because Pastor Alden, who had stood in my doorway and heard me describe the forgery, mentioned the situation to his wife. His wife mentioned it to Gretchen, who taught the Sunday school program at the same church. Gretchen mentioned it to her daughter, who worked in billing at the medical complex where my compliance team operates. Within 10 days, 3 women who had known Josephine for over a decade sat differently in her presence. They did not accuse. They did not confront. They simply rearranged the space around her so that she was always slightly outside the circle. Josephine could feel the geometry change. She stopped going. The empty seat at the Wednesday group stayed empty through February and into March, and no one put a jacket on it to save it. On a Thursday afternoon in early February, Josephine drove to the south side of town and parked in front of Lot 47 South Ridge Estates. The street was new asphalt with no curbs yet, gravel shoulders, orange construction cones marking where the storm drains would eventually go. Dario's house was a wooden skeleton against the gray February sky, framed walls with no sheathing, roof trusses with no plywood, just bare lumber angled against the clouds. Tar paper stapled to the east wall, one corner torn loose by wind, flapping with a sound like a slow heartbeat. A portable toilet stood next to a stack of 2x6s that was starting to warp and darken from moisture. A padlocked toolbox sat on the concrete slab. No one had unlocked it in 2 weeks. Josephine walked through the front door frame, which had no door, and sat down on an overturned 5-gallon paint bucket in what was supposed to be the living room. Rain was coming through the open roof. It dripped on the slab in a rhythm that had no pattern and no end. She held her phone in both hands. Griffin's number was on the screen. She had typed it, but she had not pressed call. She had typed it 4 times in the last week. Each time she stared at the number and then locked the screen. She sat there for 40 minutes. The rain did not stop. She did not press call. There was nothing left to say that would make the house stand up, or the ventilator go back into her son's throat, or the wire transfer resume its monthly arrival in her account. On February 4th, I pinned the original healthcare proxy form to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a stethoscope that Rory had given me as a joke 3 Christmases ago. Rory came over that evening. He brought soup. He sat on my couch and we watched a basketball game, and he did not ask me how I was feeling because he could see how I was feeling, and he did not need to fill the air with questions that had obvious answers. Before he left, he looked at the proxy form on the fridge and said, "That is my name in your handwriting." I said, "That is the only signature on that form that matters." He nodded once and left. I stood in my kitchen on a February morning. The legitimate discharge papers were on the counter, signed by me in my own handwriting, dated January 18th. My hospital badge was clipped to my jacket on the hook by the front door. The jacket was clean. The badge was straight. I was going back to work on Monday. There was coffee in the pot. Winter light came through the window above the sink, pale and precise, the kind of light that does not warm anything, but lets you see every surface clearly. My phone was on the counter next to the coffee. It had not rung in 6 days. No one was asking for a check. No one was asking me to guarantee a loan for a house I would never be invited to. No one was telling a doctor how much I cost per night. No one was forging my name on a form that decided whether I breathed. The proxy form on the fridge said Rory Kelman in my handwriting. The discharge papers on the counter said January 18th in my handwriting. Both signatures were mine. Both meant exactly what they said. The coffee was hot, the apartment was quiet, and for the first time in 12 years, the quiet belonged to me.